Hey guys. Tonight we begin with the sad, strange, and sometimes downright dangerous life of a man whose job was to make everyone else laugh. The medieval court jester. The floppy hat, the bells, the jokes. It all sounds like fun and games, until you realize you were one wrong joke away from the dungeon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you want to be a court jester? Too bad. No one wants to be a jester. It's not something you train for. It's something that happens to you, like the plague, or being born left-handed in a world of swords. Most jesters didn't start out dreaming of juggling turnips in front of moody aristocrats. They were often chosen, not for their ambition or resume, but because of something unique about them. You might have had a limp, a hunchback, a high-pitched voice. Maybe you were unusually clever, unusually weird, or unusually short. Either way, someone important pointed and said, "That one, he's funny. Let's keep him." Congratulations. Your personality has been conscripted. Sometimes it started with a single joke. You made a noble laugh once at a feast, probably by accident. You slipped in the mud, or mocked a rival baron just loud enough to be heard. The next morning, you're not back in your peasant hut. You're in the castle, being handed a hat with bells and a new job description. Be entertaining forever. Other times, you were purchased. Yes, bought. Lords sometimes collected jesters, like they collected exotic animals or oversized goblets. If you were especially witty or weird-looking, you might get gifted from one court to another like a party favor wrapped in sarcasm. You didn't apply to be a jester. You got chosen the way a chicken gets chosen for the stew pot, suddenly and without consultation. And from that moment on, your life was no longer your own. You were the designated laugh dispenser, dragged out during feasts, summoned during tense political meetings, and paraded like a mascot when foreign diplomats came calling. You couldn't say no, you couldn't walk away. Not unless you wanted to return to the farm, or worse, get mistaken for a vagrant and end up in the stocks. Because in the medieval world, a man without a job, land, or purpose was just asking to be arrested for existing. So yes, in theory, you're an entertainer. But in reality, you're a high-pressure, low-pay, full-time joke machine kept on retainer by people who can have you whipped for bad timing. And that's just how the audition worked. You may not be on stage with a spotlight, but make no mistake. In the medieval court, you're always performing. Being a jester isn't a job you clock into. It's your existence. You eat, sleep, and breathe among nobles, but you're never really one of them. You're their entertainment, their curiosity, their live-in what-if scenario. The court's emotional support oddity. You're not allowed to be invisible. Everyone sees you, and they expect something the moment they do. A joke, a twirl, a clever insult at someone else's expense. You are, in essence, the world's most exhausted novelty act, forever one smirk away from being called boring. Even when you're not officially summoned to perform, you're still being watched. Walking through the Great Hall. Better strut. Passing the Queen's table at supper. Better wink or curtsy ironically. Sitting alone in the corner for 5 seconds. Someone will say, "Why isn't the fool being foolish?" And heaven forbid you show a real human emotion. Sadness. That makes people uncomfortable. Anger. Dangerous. Quiet reflection. Suspicious. If you're not grinning like an idiot while half dancing on one foot, they assume you're planning treason. Worse still, you live in the palace but not like a prince. You sleep somewhere near the kitchens or tucked into a spare closet that used to house brooms. Your quarters are just close enough to hear all the laughter, but never be included in it. You eat what's left over, you wear what's given. You exist as a fixture of fun, not a person. And if someone important is bored or irritable, guess who gets summoned to fix it? You. If a nobleman's hunting party failed, if the wine cellar ran dry, if the king's favorite dog coughed weird. Someone is coming to knock on your door at midnight with, "Do something amusing." You are not allowed to be. You are only allowed to entertain. Which means the line between your true self and your persona gets so blurry, you forget who you were before the bells and jokes and forced smiles. In the medieval court, you don't just wear the costume, you are the costume. And trust me, the show never ends. Being a jester sounds fun, until you realize you're required to be funny constantly. You don't get to be off. You don't get quiet days. You don't get to have moods. Your entire identity is expected to be one endless laugh track, no matter what else is going on in the world. Or your own life. Your job description. Be hilarious on demand. Even if the Duke just buried his third wife. Even if the kingdom is at war. Even if you woke up with a toothache and crushed morale. Doesn't matter. You're still expected to juggle, tell a pun, or fall flat on your face with grace. No pressure, right? And don't even think about reusing jokes. These are nobles after all. They want fresh entertainment. That witty poem you worked on for a week? Great. Now do 12 more before lunch. And while you're at it, impersonate 3 courtiers, write a satire of the bishop's sermon, and pretend to trip on a goose. Now, and if you bomb, you're not just getting a bad Yelp review, you're getting jeered, slapped, possibly pelted with chicken bones. Or worse, replaced. Medieval courts didn't have HR departments. If you failed to amuse the wrong person on the wrong day, your next gig might involve cleaning chamber pots or digging your own grave. And remember, you're the only one in the room not allowed to be serious. Everyone else can cry, rage, pray, scheme, or fall apart. You juggle through the tension. You laugh through royal tantrums. You dance around political intrigue with a stupid hat on your head and a forced smile on your face. And you can't say, "I'm not feeling it today." Feelings are irrelevant. Your entire value depends on how many chuckles you can wring from people who think sarcasm is foreplay and cruelty is wit. So yes, being the funny one sounds great in theory. But when your survival depends on your ability to entertain people who could legally execute you for a bad punchline, it's less stand-up comedy, and more medieval emotional hostage-taking. In a medieval court, the line between funny and offensive is razor-thin, and you're expected to tiptoe across it blindfolded, juggling insults. As a jester, your job is to mock, tease, and comment on everything: kings, queens, clergy, guests, but never too harshly, never too directly, and never at the wrong moment. One misplaced quip about the king's expanding waistline or the lord's 4th marriage, and suddenly you're not the funny man. You're the fool who crossed a line. And here's the real kicker: that line moves. On Monday, the Queen laughs when you joke about her cousin's gambling habits. On Tuesday, he's in the room and now it's treason. On Wednesday, she laughs again, but too hard, and the king looks displeased. On Thursday, you're being escorted out by guards for disturbing the peace of courtly decorum. There's no safe zone, not really. Jokes about politics, risky, religion, suicidal, physical appearances, very dangerous. Royal failures, absolutely not. Unless you wrap it in 3 layers of metaphor and a juggling routine. Even then, maybe don't. Some jesters developed an art of truth through absurdity, couching social criticism in riddles, double meanings, and animal metaphors. The rooster with the sharp tongue and no eggs might want to crow less in the morning, you say, hoping the king laughs instead of orders your execution. But it's a gamble. Always, if the noble you mock is in a bad mood. That's your neck. If the bishop thinks your joke implies he's greedy, that's blasphemy. If the court turns against you, the same people who once roared with laughter will suddenly clutch their pearls and pretend they never found you amusing. And don't expect anyone to defend you. The jester isn't protected. You're not clergy. You're not nobility. You're a fool with a license to speak. A license that can be revoked with a single glare. Some jesters were whipped. Some were banished. Some were hanged. Others were retired, which in medieval terms often meant buried without a funeral. So yes, humour was your weapon, but it was also your noose. And in court, timing was everything. Miss the beat. Lose your head. Before you even speak, the room is already laughing at what you're wearing. As a medieval jester, your wardrobe isn't made for dignity. It's made to humiliate. The moment you step into court, your entire outfit screams one thing. I'm not a person. I'm a punchline. Let's start with the hat. The famous coxcomb, a multicoloured flopping horned monstrosity with bells attached to the tips. Bells. Not because it helps with your performance, but because people want to hear you coming like a walking wind chime of low self-worth. Your tunic. A checkerboard of clashing colours no sane tailor would combine on purpose. Yellow and blue, red and green. Bright garish patches sewn together like a tapestry made by someone who hates your dignity. Your shoes. Curled toe slippers, also with bells. Perfect for slipping on spilled mead or tripping over your own relevance. They make you look like a court-approved goblin, which frankly is the point. Even your belt is a joke, often oversized or knotted in ways that prevent practicality. Need to carry a knife or pouch? Forget it. That's not what you're here for. You're here to jiggle, dance and fall on your face in a glorified mascot uniform. And while nobles wear velvet, silk, fur and gold thread embroidery, your clothes are made from the cheapest scraps of wool and linen. If it's itchy, heavy or stained, perfect. The worse it feels, the better it looks. The audience must always remember you're beneath them. Now imagine wearing this to every feast, every wedding, every royal negotiation. There's no variation, no wardrobe change, no formal jester wear. You are visually ridiculous 24/7. Even when you're dead serious, you look like a colouring book exploded on your body. And don't expect compliments. People don't say, "Nice hat." They say, "Try not to trip over your bells today, fool." Or worse, they tug your sleeve just to hear you jingle like a holiday decoration with abandonment issues. So yes, your clothes might be iconic, but they're also a uniform of humiliation. A reminder that even when your words are sharp, your outfit must be dull-witted enough to reassure the powerful that you're never truly a threat. Just an echo in a funny hat. You sleep under the same roof as dukes, barons and kings. But make no mistake, you're not one of them. You're part of the furniture, like a tapestry that makes noise. Your room, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a glorified storage closet tucked behind the kitchens or near the servants' quarters. A space just far enough to remind you you're not important, and just close enough to be dragged out at a moment's notice for a midnight joke or awkward wedding toast. At meals, you don't sit with the nobles. You stand near them, close enough to overhear gossip, be insulted mid-bite, or have a piece of chicken flung at your head in jest. You might be allowed to eat from the same platters, but always last, after the nobles, the priests, the dog, and occasionally the stable boy. And yet, you hear everything. Affairs, plots, murmured insults, the truth behind marriages and treaties. You are the unwanted ear in the room, the one nobody stops talking around, because in their minds, you're too lowly to matter. You're harmless, a fool, but that doesn't stop you from knowing everything, and sometimes that knowledge keeps you alive, or gets you killed. The irony is cruel. You live among nobility, you know their secrets, you share their meals, but socially, you're stranded. The nobles won't befriend you. The servants won't trust you. You're too high for one world, too low for the other. Your presence is tolerated, but not respected. You're allowed into spaces peasants never see, but only so long as you're amusing. You're patted on the head like a performing animal, not welcomed like a guest. If you speak too plainly or ask for something real, a favor, protection, respect, you're reminded immediately. Know your place, fool. You are, quite literally, a resident outsider. You can mimic the court, mock the lords, entertain the ladies, but you'll never inherit land, marry into nobility, or wear a sword for honor. Your future is as fixed as your bells. So yes, you live with the nobles, but you live among them the way a shadow lives among light. always present, never truly visible. You've spent years honing your skills, juggling knives, reciting witty verse, playing instruments, mimicking voices, composing satire that could rival Cicero. And yet, no one thinks of you as talented. They think of you as amusing. That's the curse of being a jester. No matter how much skill, creativity, or performance mastery you have, your genius is constantly treated like a party trick. You compose clever rhymes in multiple languages. They'll chuckle and say, "Do the funny face again." You craft a biting piece of political satire disguised as a joke about sheep. Someone throws a grape at your head and tells you not to get too clever. You are expected to be brilliant, but never acknowledged as such. If a noble sings a song, everyone applauds. If you sing better, the room goes silent. If a baron tells a joke, it's praised for its boldness. If you tell the same joke better, it's called sassy or inappropriate. And woe unto you if you actually outshine someone important. Nobles don't like being upstaged, especially by someone dressed like a Christmas ornament. You're supposed to sparkle, not eclipse. So you play a strange game, perform just well enough to keep your job, but not so well that you make anyone feel inferior. Be witty, but not wise. Be sharp, but not threatening. Be brilliant. And then immediately juggle something to remind everyone you're not that clever. It's a balancing act on the edge of a sword. And here's the real tragedy. Many jesters were incredibly skilled. Musicians, acrobats, poets, political thinkers, all hiding behind a mask of idiocy, because brilliance in a fool's mouth is only tolerated if it comes with a pratfall and a jingle. You know what's worse? They laugh hardest when you mess up. Miss a joke, trip mid-dance, drop a lute, that's when they roar. Not because you meant to, but because failure reinforces what they want to believe, that you're just an idiot in a loud outfit, not someone clever enough to mock them in their own tongue. So yes, your talent may be the most refined in the room, but your applause, it only ever comes wrapped in condescension. Feasts in a medieval court are grand, glistening roasts, overflowing wine goblets, minstrels plucking away in the background. It's a festival of excess. And you're the main course of humiliation. From the moment guests arrive, nobles are eyeing you like a toy they can poke for laughs. Do a trick, fool. Tell a joke. Imitate Lord Wensley and his lazy eye. You perform, not because you want to, but because the mood of 100 powerful drunken nobles depends on your ability to not take offense while being publicly mocked, grabbed, teased, and possibly slapped. You don't sit at the table. You orbit it like a bright, jingly satellite of shame. You move from group to group like a courtly Roomba, cleaning up awkward silences with a clever line or a badly timed handstand. You are always available, but never invited. And when the wine starts flowing heavily, that's when things turn. Suddenly your performance becomes a game for everyone else. Someone pulls your hat down over your eyes. Another demands a pig impression. Someone else throws a leg bone at you and laughs when you flinch. Because here's the thing, you're not just entertainment. You're a social punching bag, a safety valve for the elite. Nobles can't insult each other, but they can insult you. And they do, constantly. They mock your clothes, your voice, your background, your worth. Not because they hate you, but because you're convenient. Because laughing at the jester makes everyone feel smarter, richer, and safer. You're the joke that keeps the system in balance. You smile, you take it. You keep the laughter going, because the alternative is silence. And in the medieval court, silence is dangerous. Silence means tension. Silence means attention shifts. And you do not want the spotlight to land on someone more important than you, and find you unfunny in the process. So yes, you're at every feast. But you're not celebrated. You're consumed, like the bread and wine, swallowed and forgotten by the time the goblets are cleared. And when everyone goes to bed full and satisfied, you go back to your closet-sized room with bruised ribs and a sore smile. By day, you're a jester, flinging jokes, juggling apples, and taking verbal punches like a trained clown in a velvet cage. But by night, you're a weapon. The crown might laugh at your tumbling act, but they know your real value isn't in your slapstick. It's in your ears. You see, being a fool comes with a strange perk. You're invisible in plain sight. Nobles speak freely around you. Servants forget you're there. Guests vent their frustrations while you pour their wine. You drift from corner to corner like furniture with feet, catching everything. You hear confessions that weren't meant to be heard. Treason whispered between cousins. Affairs confessed over goblets. Bribes, threats, alliances forming in the shade of the feast. And you remember it all. Not because you're nosy, but because it keeps you alive. Because sometimes the king calls you aside. He says, "Fool, tell me what the bishop said to the French envoy last night." And you'd better have the answer. If you don't, he might think you're loyal to someone else. If you do, he might ask for more. This is the terrible dance. The king wants truth from your lips, but no truth that implicates him. You serve a monarch who praises your honesty, until your honesty offends. You're expected to report quietly, cleverly, maybe even in riddle form, who's sleeping with whose wife, or who's plotting a little light rebellion over stew. You're the court's most dangerous informant, disguised as the least dangerous person in the room. But there's a catch. Everyone else knows it. The lords and ladies smile at you, but they don't trust you. Servants stop talking when you walk by. The guards eye you like you're holding a dagger behind your back. And in a way, you are. Your weapon is information. And information in a medieval court is just a sharp joke away from being deadly. So you're always listening. Always choosing which truth to tell, and which one to bury under a harmless punchline. Because in a world full of swords and secrets, the most dangerous blade isn't forged from steel. It's tucked behind a fool's grin. In the medieval court, your job is to keep everyone else laughing, even when you're falling apart inside. Your dog died? Doesn't matter. The Queen still expects you to make a joke about her cousin's wig. You've got a fever. Too bad. The Duke had a bad hunting day, and he needs a laugh before he throws his plate. Your heart's broken? Keep dancing, fool. This is a wedding. You are not allowed to have feelings unless they're funny ones. Sadness? That's selfish. Anger? Insubordination. Fatigue? Laziness. Anything short of cheerful absurdity is treated like a betrayal. If you show real emotion, people get uncomfortable. Not because they care, but because you're failing your function. They don't see you as a person with a soul and scars. They see you as court furniture with jokes. You're expected to absorb everyone else's moods, and reflect none of your own. You must sit through drunken tirades, mocking laughter, passive-aggressive insults, and the occasional flying chicken leg. And smile through it all. Sometimes you perform while grieving. Sometimes you perform while ill. Sometimes you perform while quietly begging the universe to just let you disappear behind a curtain and cry for 5 blessed minutes. But there's no curtain, no privacy. You're always on, and the idea of vulnerability doesn't fit your costume. And here's the cruelest twist. When nobles do notice you're down, they don't ask what's wrong. They say, "Why aren't you being funny today?" Or worse, "Maybe the fool's finally lost it. Shall we find a new one?" So what do? You turn your pain into performance. You make your heartbreak a punchline. You laugh first and louder before they can. You build a fortress of wit around your exhaustion, and you don't let anyone see inside. Because the moment they realize the fool is human, the illusion shatters, and so does your job. So yes, you had feelings. You just learned to bury them under bells and jokes, like everyone expected. Because in the court, when everyone else gets to feel things, the fool is the one who pretends nothing hurts. Medieval kings were not known for emotional stability. One bad dream, one spoiled roast, one poorly timed sneeze from a foreign diplomat, and the entire mood of the court shifts like a thundercloud with a crown. And guess who they all look at when the king furrows his brow or frowns into his goblet? You. Because if the monarch isn't smiling, clearly the fool isn't doing his job. It doesn't matter that you were up late performing at a feast, or that your voice is hoarse from singing, or that you told 12 jokes this morning that got genuine chuckles from 3 knights and a cook. If the king wakes up irritable, the court looks at you like you personally ruined breakfast. You're not just the jester. You're the court's emotional insurance policy. Did a trade negotiation fail? The king's advisors mutter. Perhaps the fool didn't lighten the tension enough. Did the queen scowl during mass? Maybe the jester made a joke in poor taste. Did the king stub his toe on a chamber pot? Has the fool been leaving things about again? Sometimes it's subtle, a snide comment, a disapproving glare. Other times it's direct. Entertain me, fool. I'm in a foul mood, and your head's in the balance. And they're not kidding. You're one ill-timed silence away from being demoted to stable cleaner or worse, executed for being unfunny. And even when it's not your fault, it becomes your burden. You must fix the mood, patch the tension, make the royal toddler laugh so no one notices the king just broke a goblet over the steward's head. You become a human emotional thermostat, adjusting yourself endlessly so everyone else stays warm and content. But here's the thing, no one ever thanks you. If the king's mood improves, it's because his wine was strong. If he laughs, it's because someone told him a joke earlier, not you. If he doesn't laugh, you're at fault. Either way, you lose. So yes, in a court of paranoia and politics, you, the jester, are somehow both irrelevant and responsible for the mood of the most powerful man in the kingdom. And if he doesn't laugh, you'd better start praying. You may live in the castle, wear bells on your hat and share jokes with kings. But make no mistake, you are not free. In fact, you're more trapped than most. Because being a medieval court jester isn't just a job. It's an identity that consumes you. Once you're labelled the fool, that's it. There's no promotion, no career change, no, I'd like to try something different. You're a lifelong performer, whether you want to be or not. Doesn't matter if you're aging, tired or sick. You don't get to retire. There's no pension, no cosy cottage waiting at the edge of the kingdom. You don't become a merchant or a monk or a respected elder. You're not master whatever your name was. You're still the fool, just slower, sadder, and with fewer teeth. And the worst part, even if you're brilliant, no one will ever see past the hat. You might write poetry, you might speak 4 languages, you might secretly know more about statecraft than the royal council. But when you speak, everyone hears bells and expects pratfalls. You could warn of war and be ignored, but if you slip on a turnip, they'll laugh for hours. You become a costume with a voice. And try leaving? Good luck. You're not trained in a trade. You own no land. You have no connections outside the castle walls. If you wander into a town, you're not seen as that sharp-witted court performer. You're just a strange, poorly dressed man babbling about dukes and drama, probably mistaken for a madman or vagrant. And if you do leave, and somehow survive, what then? You'll miss meals. You'll be forgotten. And sooner or later, some lesser noble will say, "Bring back the old fool. He made us laugh." And just like that, you're dragged back in. Because you're not a man. You're an object that people remember when they're bored. So you stay. You perform. You laugh at your own pain, because the alternative is terrifying. Because once you're the fool, you stay the fool. Forever. Here's the strange thing about being a fool. In a room full of nobles, bishops, and knights, you might be the only one allowed to speak the truth. Everyone else in court speaks in riddles. Diplomats flatter. Courtiers scheme. Servants lie to survive. But you've got one strange, dangerous privilege. You can say what others can't. You can mock a policy the king refuses to reconsider. You can whisper jokes that call out corruption. You can impersonate the baron who's clearly embezzling grain, or the duchess with a suspiciously close friendship to the bishop's nephew. And somehow, get away with it. But let's be clear. getting away with it doesn't mean you're safe. It means you're walking a high wire strung between comedy and execution. The court laughs because they're pretending it's just a joke. But you know the truth. It's never just a joke. That jest about the war, that's a political opinion in disguise. That pun about the taxes, that's public dissent, delicately wrapped in wordplay. You are the only honest voice in the room, and everyone knows it. And that scares them. Some will admire you quietly, others will hate you openly, but all will watch your every word. Because one misstep, one joke too sharp, one truth too close, and the same crown that once chuckled at your cleverness may have your head rolling across the tiles by morning. In a world where saying the wrong thing could get anyone imprisoned, the Jester was the court's built-in truth serum, but with no protection. You are the moral mirror, the court's conscience in bells. You're allowed to point at the naked emperor, so long as you do it with a backflip and a silly voice. But if your truth cuts too deep, or if the king is in a particularly fragile mood, well, jesters have been silenced before. So yes, in a court built on secrets, your job is to shine a flickering lantern into the shadows and pretend it's a spotlight gag. Because sometimes the only one brave enough to speak the truth is the man everyone refuses to take seriously. You spend your life surrounded by people. Nobles, knights, ladies, guests. You entertain at feasts, weddings, coronations, and even funerals. Your voice echoes in great halls. Your jokes fill chambers with laughter. And yet, when your time comes, no one is there. The jester's life is filled with noise, but his death is usually silent. You die in a corner room, unnoticed, unmourned. No parade, no eulogy, no marble slab etched with your cleverest line. You don't get remembered like a knight or a bard. You're not written into songs or family histories. You're just gone. Maybe the cook mentions you once, years later. Remember that fool who used to dance like a goat? Maybe a new jester finds your old bells in a drawer and doesn't ask whose they were. Or maybe no one remembers you at all, because someone else took your place before your bed even went cold. Because you weren't a person to them, not really. You were a sound, a colour, a flicker of amusement, replaceable, disposable. And the very thing that made you valuable, your ability to disappear behind a joke, is the same thing that ensures you're forgotten. You never marry, you never have heirs, you never own land or build a name. You make everyone else feel important, but you leave no legacy of your own. Even your closest friend in court, the steward who once laughed at your imitation of the bishop, won't visit your grave. You might be buried outside the churchyard because fools weren't considered holy enough for consecrated ground. Too many jokes, not enough prayers. You lived for their laughter. You measured your worth in their joy. But laughter is fleeting. It echoes once and fades. And when you're gone, the halls grow quiet until the next fool arrives, juggling for applause. So yes, your life brought others cheer. You made kings forget their worries and lords drop their pride. But when your candle finally burns out, there's no crowd, no fanfare, just silence. And maybe, just maybe, the soft jingle of bells, remembered by no one. To the lords and ladies of the medieval court, the jester was entertainment, comic relief in a tense world of politics, war, and ceremony. But look closer, and you'll see. The jester wasn't just there to amuse. He was there to remind. He was a walking contradiction. Low-born, yet allowed to mock kings. Powerless, yet speaking truth to power. Ridiculed, yet feared. He stood at the center of the feast, jingling and spinning, not to be celebrated, but to be studied. Because the jester was a mirror. His jokes revealed things no one else dared to say. His puns disguised political commentary. His mimicry revealed hypocrisy. And every time he made the room laugh, he also made it squirm. Because somewhere in the slapstick, there was always a sliver of truth. The fool was safe to laugh at, until he wasn't. until he pointed out too much, until the room realized, this man in bells and rags understands us better than we'd like. And so he became more than a performer. He became a symbol, a reminder that power is fragile, that truth, even dressed in comedy, can be dangerous, that laughter is a weapon, one that can cut deeper than any sword. In a world obsessed with order and hierarchy, the Jester was the exception, and that's what made him so necessary. He walked the halls of power, not because he was respected, but because he reminded the powerful of what they feared most, being ridiculous, being exposed, being human. But the joke, in the end, was never truly on the nobles. It was on him. He sacrificed dignity, freedom, legacy, and peace of mind for the fleeting approval of people who would never see him as an equal. His genius was hidden beneath absurdity, his wisdom wrapped in wordplay, his truth dismissed as foolishness. And yet, centuries later, we still remember him, not as a clown, but as something more complex, more haunting, more real. The medieval Jester was not a joke. He was a warning that sometimes the only one telling the truth is the one you're busy laughing at. Long before curtains rose and actors bowed, ancient theatre was born in a swirl of wine, masks, and divine chaos. It didn't start with playwrights or applause. It began with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, fertility, ritual madness, and performance. In 6th century BCE Athens, theatre wasn't just culture, it was cult. The earliest dramas emerged during the city Dionysia, a spring festival honoring the god himself. Citizens flooded the city in celebration. Livestock was sacrificed. Wine flowed like rivers. And in the midst of this revelry, something miraculous happened. People started acting, not pretending, but becoming, taking on voices not their own, dancing in frenzied circles, chanting choruses that blurred the line between prayer and performance. The centerpiece, a dithyramb, a wild hymn-like chant performed by a chorus of up to 50 men, moving in rhythm, faces masked, eyes aflame with ecstasy. These weren't actors as we know them. They were vessels, mediums, each voice a drop in the divine pool of Dionysian energy. Then came a man named Thespis. Legend says Thespis stepped out from the chorus around 534 BCE and spoke as a character rather than as part of a group. Just like that, the concept of an actor was born. That's why we still call performers thespians today. Imagine it. One man, alone on stage, claiming to be someone else. It must have felt like blasphemy, or magic. The Greeks were hooked. What began as sacred ritual started evolving into structured performance. Playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles would soon refine it further, adding a second and third actor, introducing dialogue, plot, and the idea of dramatic conflict. But the spiritual core never left. These early performances took place in massive open-air theatres carved into hillsides, most famously the Theatre of Dionysus in Athens. It could hold up to 17,000 spectators, all gathered in a semicircle to witness something that straddled religion, art, and civic duty. So no, theatre didn't start in silence. It arrived loud, masked, drenched in wine, and fueled by gods. The stage wasn't just a place to pretend, it was a portal to myth, madness, and meaning. And it all started with the need to celebrate something bigger than ourselves. Welcome to the stage. As Greek theatre matured, it became more than divine devotion. It became a mirror through which Athenians could see their own fears, failures, and fleeting glories reflected under the Mediterranean sun. But to truly understand that mirror, we have to talk about two things: tragedy and masks. Tragedy, or tragoidia, literally goat song, is a word that still echoes in modern storytelling, but its origins are hazy and strange. It might refer to goats sacrificed to Dionysus, or perhaps the prize, a goat, awarded to the best performer. Either way, by the 5th century BCE, tragedy had crystallized into a formal art. The plays were structured, poetic, and overwhelmingly fatal. Think fate, betrayal, vengeance, hubris, and gods who toyed with mortals like cats play with mice. And at the center of it all were masks. Greek actors didn't just play roles, they transformed. Each actor, typically male, could portray multiple characters using distinct masks. A twisted mouth for sorrow, a wide-eyed face of fear, a delicate feminine mask for goddesses and queens. These masks weren't subtle. They were oversized, stylized, and often exaggerated, so even the person in the worst seat at the top of the amphitheater could feel the character's emotion. Behind the mask, the actor's voice was everything. Projection and clarity mattered more than naturalism. With no microphones or lighting, actors had to command a sea of thousands using nothing but breath, tone, and precise physicality. One actor might kneel in grief, another might howl into the sky, all of it unfolding beneath the open heavens. Tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides revolutionized the form. Aeschylus added a second actor, Sophocles a third, and Euripides brought psychological depth and raw emotion that made his characters bleed on the page. They tackle themes of divine injustice, war trauma, and the limits of human reason. Oedipus, Antigone, Medea. These weren't just plays. They were philosophical battlegrounds. And yet, despite all this darkness, Greek theatre wasn't a funeral. It was a civic celebration. Tragedies were performed competitively, like Olympic Games for the soul. The entire city would attend, including the poor. Wealthy citizens even paid for the production as a form of public service. The stage had become sacred ground, and the mask, a tool of revelation. The Greeks had found a way to stare into chaos, and call it art. While tragedy grappled with gods and doom, Greek comedy pulled down its tunic and mooned the universe. By the late 5th century BCE, as Athens blossomed into a cultural and intellectual superpower, comedy emerged as its rebellious younger sibling. It was raw, irreverent, and loud, a theatrical playground where no one, not even the gods, was safe from ridicule. If tragedy asked, "What is the meaning of suffering?" comedy asked, "Why is Zeus such a pompous idiot?" The master of this art was Aristophanes, the Shakespeare of satire. His plays like Lysistrata, The Clouds and the Frogs were brilliant, bawdy, and biting. Lysistrata, for example, tells of women who withhold sex to force their men to stop waging war. It was revolutionary, hilarious, and politically loaded. Imagine watching a play where the characters are making fun of your government, your neighbors, and your own bad habits, and everyone's laughing in the open. Comedy plays were still part of religious festivals, like the city Dionysia, often performed right after the tragic trilogies. The audience would go from crying over Antigone to roaring with laughter as a chorus of dancing sausages mocked corrupt politicians. Masks in comedy were even more exaggerated than those in tragedy. Grotesque faces with bulging eyes, snub noses, and enormous, male appendages to guarantee laughter even from the back row. Costumes were padded, wigs were wild, and the chorus might show up as frogs, wasps, birds, or clouds, depending on the joke. But Greek comedy wasn't all slapstick. It was deeply political. Aristophanes attacked warmongers, philosophers, and playwrights with surgical precision. The Clouds mocked Socrates so ruthlessly that some scholars believe it contributed to the public mistrust that eventually led to his trial. As the classical age matured, comedy evolved. New comedy, in the 4th century BCE, softened the satire and focused on domestic plots. Mistaken identities, romantic entanglements, clever slaves outwitting dim-witted masters. Playwrights like Menander laid the groundwork for what would later influence Roman comedies and even modern sitcoms. Greek comedy was more than laughter. It was truth-telling in disguise. A democratic city speaking to itself in riddles and punchlines, masks and music, dance and defiance. Where tragedy asked, "What is fate?" comedy replied, "Isn't it ridiculous how we try to control it?" When the Romans inherited the stage from the Greeks, They didn't whisper tragedy into the wind. They built colossal amphitheatres, stuffed them with thousands of spectators, and said, "Let's make it louder." Theatre in ancient Rome was never just about art. It was about power, performance, and pleasing the masses. The earliest Roman plays were translations of Greek works, adapted by playwrights like Livius Andronicus and Plautus, who Romanized the humor, dialed up the physical gags, and simplified the plots for wider appeal. The result? Theatre that was rowdy, fast-paced, and obsessed with mistaken identity, lewd jokes, and ridiculous characters who always ended up running in circles. Plautus and his successor Terence are remembered for refining Roman comedy, turning it into a genre of clever slaves, clueless lovers, and fathers in crisis, characters that would become templates for Western comedy for centuries. Their plays didn't just entertain. They poked fun at Roman society's absurdities, snobbery, greed, social climbing, and hypocrisy. But Roman tragedy was a different beast. While Greek tragedies were philosophical and poetic, Roman tragedies, especially those of Seneca, were intense, violent, and sometimes downright disturbing. Seneca's Thyestes, for example, features a scene where a man unknowingly eats his own children. Not exactly a night of light entertainment. Seneca's influence, however, wouldn't peak until much later. In his own time, Roman tragedy played second fiddle to what truly won the public's favor: spectacle. Romans loved blood, noise, and grandeur. Theatre often competed with chariot races and gladiator fights, so playwrights and producers upped the drama, literally. Staging was lavish. Some productions featured trapdoors, cranes, and even water effects. Music was everywhere, often drowning out the dialogue. Actors wore masks similar to the Greeks, but their performances leaned more on exaggerated gesture than nuanced emotion. And in some extreme cases, deaths on stage weren't acted. They were real executions woven into the story. That's Rome for you. For emperors, the theatre also became a tool of propaganda. Augustus and Nero used it to promote imperial ideology. Nero, in fact, fancied himself an actor and forced audiences to sit through his endless performances, or risk execution for walking out. In Rome, the stage was a battleground for attention, glory, and influence. Less sacred than Greek theatre, but far more sensational. It was no longer about catharsis, it was about control. Far from the marble stages of Greece and the booming arenas of Rome, a different form of theatre blossomed in ancient India. One that was rich in spirituality, philosophy, and refined aesthetics. Indian theatre wasn't born in festivals of wine, but in the quiet depths of sacred texts and oral tradition. Its foundation lies in the Natya Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit treatise on drama attributed to the sage Parata, dated somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. This wasn't just a manual on performance, it was a cosmic blueprint. According to the text, theatre was created by the gods as a divine offering to humanity, a way to educate, entertain, and uplift the soul. The Natya Shastra outlines everything: stage construction, character types, gestures, facial expressions, music, and even the psychological effects of drama. It emphasizes rasa, the emotional essence evoked in the audience. Whether it's Sringara, romantic love, Karuna, compassion, or Raudra, fury, each play aimed to stir the soul and guide it toward enlightenment. Performances were elaborate, yet disciplined. Actors trained for years in voice, movement, and mudras, codified hand gestures used to express meaning without words. Dialogue was often sung or chanted, and stories came from epic texts like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, weaving together mythology, morality, and magic. One of the earliest known playwrights was Kalidasa, whose drama Shakuntala still stands as a masterpiece of world literature. His works weren't just popular, they were revered. Audiences expected to be moved emotionally and spiritually. They came not just for a story, but for a refined experience of being. Theatre in India was inclusive in an entirely different sense. While elite courts often sponsored performances, folk traditions also flourished. Sanskrit theatre existed alongside regional village drama, puppet theatre, and dance drama forms like Kathakali and Yakshagana, each with its own rules, costumes, and musical rhythms. Unlike in Rome, where the goal was spectacle, or in Greece, where the aim was civic reflection, Indian theatre sought to harmonize, to balance emotion, intellect, and spirit. It was both performance and prayer, art and dharma. In this world of silks, incense, and layered symbol, the actor wasn't just an entertainer, they were a spiritual vessel, bridging myth and reality, embodying the timeless stories that made sense of life and death. In ancient China, theatre didn't erupt into existence, it unfolded, like a delicate fan, over centuries of music, dance, and ritual. Before there were scripts and actors, there were shamans, court performers, and sacred ceremonies blending movement with meaning. Chinese theatrical roots stretch back over 3,000 years to the Zhou dynasty, when masked dances known as nuo were performed to ward off evil spirits. These weren't for laughs, they were solemn, spiritual affairs. Over time, these rituals evolved, absorbing elements of storytelling, mime, and music. By the Tang dynasty, 7th–10th centuries CE, a true theatrical form was taking shape, one that balanced aesthetics, discipline, and philosophy. The Tang court, under Emperor Xuanzong, even established the Pear Garden, the first known royal acting academy. Actors trained in voice, dance, acrobatics, and gesture. It's no wonder that performers in traditional Chinese theatre are still called children of the Pear Garden today, but it was during the Yuan dynasty, 13th–14th century, that Chinese drama truly bloomed. Under Mongol rule, Confucian censorship loosened, and popular entertainment surged. Zhazhu, a genre of poetic drama, rose in prominence. It featured structured arias, comic interludes, and strong female leads, sometimes played by actual women, a rarity in global theatre history. Enter Guan Hanqing, a Yuan playwright often compared to Shakespeare. His works, like The Injustice to Dewey, were packed with emotional depth, social critique, and lyrical beauty. They told stories of unjust rulers, moral dilemmas, and tragic heroines, with performances relying on symbolic gesture, stylized movement, and minimal scenery. The audience was expected to read the body as much as hear the words. From these roots came Chinese opera, a rich and dazzling tradition that fully emerged by the Ming and Qing dynasties. The most famous form, Peking opera or Jingju, crystallized in the 18th century. With ornate costumes, color-coded makeup, martial arts, and piercing falsetto voices, it turned performance into a ritualized visual language. Each movement, raising a sleeve, tilting the head, was loaded with meaning. The stage was almost bare, yet your imagination filled it with mountains, palaces, and battlefields. And unlike Western theatre, Chinese opera didn't aim for realism, it aimed for essence. Chinese theatre didn't just tell stories, it transmitted values, preserved history, and expressed a worldview where heaven, earth, and humanity danced in quiet harmony. In Japan, theatre emerged not with clamour or excess, but with stillness, subtlety, and sacred restraint. Among the world's oldest surviving theatrical forms, No is unlike anything that came before or after. Born in the 14th century, No was less a performance for the masses, and more a ritual for the refined soul, a whisper of drama in a world obsessed with noise. No traces its lineage to Dengaku and Sorugaku, folk dances, Buddhist chants, and comic sketches that entertained both commoners and monks. But in the 1300s, a father-son duo changed everything. Kanami and his son Ziyami elevated No into a structured, poetic, and deeply symbolic art form. Ziyami, a performer, writer, and theorist, gave No its heart. His treatises laid down a philosophy of beauty rooted in Yugen, a kind of mysterious grace or profound subtlety. In No, less wasn't just more, it was everything. Each performance blends music, dance, poetry, and drama into a single fluid expression. Actors move slowly, deliberately, often appearing more like statues than performers. Dialogue is sung or chanted, accompanied by a small ensemble of flute and drums. There is no illusion of realism. Instead, the experience is dreamlike, more like witnessing a ghost story told from within the ghost. And speaking of ghosts, many No plays are literally about spirits. Dead warriors, lost lovers, mad women, and wandering monks are frequent characters. These are not action-packed stories, but meditations on memory, loss, and longing. The main actor, or shite, typically wears a carved wooden mask, frozen in an expression that shifts subtly with the angle of the head or light. These masks are sacred objects, not props. No's stage is minimal, just a bare wooden platform with a painted pine tree backdrop. Yet this simplicity is deceptive. Every element, from the shuffle of the actor's feet to the rustle of silk robes, is choreographed to evoke the spiritual beneath the surface. Time seems to slow. The mundane dissolves. Supported and patronized by the samurai class, No became an aristocratic art. It wasn't made for cheering crowds. It was for introspection, for connection to something eternal. Even today, performances remain largely unchanged from 600 years ago. In No, the stage becomes a threshold between worlds. Life and death, form and void, voice and silence. While grand stages and noble actors stole the spotlight in many cultures, another kind of theatre quietly thrived in the shadows: puppet theatre. In Asia especially, puppetry wasn't just child's play. It was a powerful medium for myth, morality, and memory, where the inanimate whispered truths the living dared not say. In Indonesia, particularly Java and Bali, the ancient art of wayang kulit, shadow puppetry, emerged as a sacred tradition. Thin, flat puppets made from buffalo hide were intricately carved and painted, then held behind a white screen with a flickering oil lamp. The result? Silhouettes dancing in flickering light, conjuring entire worlds from shadow. At the center of it all was the dalang, the puppet master. Far more than a performer, the dalang was a spiritual guide, comedian, narrator, and philosopher rolled into one. With a single voice, he portrayed dozens of characters from Hindu epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. The stories might last for hours, even through the night, accompanied by the rhythmic pulse of a gamelan orchestra. Wayang wasn't just entertainment. It was a ritual act, often performed during temple festivals, births, funerals, or political ceremonies. Each puppet symbolized more than a character. It was a force, a lesson, a karmic echo. Meanwhile, in Japan, another mesmerizing form evolved: bunraku. Unlike wayang silhouettes, bunraku puppets are large, lifelike, and manipulated by 3 puppeteers in full view of the audience. One controls the head and right arm, another the left arm, and a third the legs. It takes years of training before a puppeteer can even touch the puppet's head. The result? Uncanny realism. A puppet woman tugs her sleeve in heartbreak. A warrior trembles before death. It's mesmerizing. The narration, however, is delivered by a single chanter, seated beside a shamisen player. His voice becomes thunder, tears, whispers, rage. The puppets move, but the soul comes from his throat. Puppetry thrived precisely because it could say what humans couldn't. In strict societies, puppets mocked emperors, questioned fate, and explored forbidden love or vengeance without retribution. After all, it wasn't a man accusing the king, it was just a doll. Whether in flickering shadows or under full lantern light, puppet theatre turned wood and string into mirrors, reflecting the deepest fears, dreams, and truths of the cultures that created them. From the drunken chants of Dionysus to the silent grace of No masks, ancient theatre didn't simply vanish. It echoed forward, reshaping how we tell stories even today. Its legacy isn't just etched in stone ruins or dusty scrolls, It's alive in every stage, screen and script. The Greeks gave us structure. Their innovations, dialogue, dramatic conflict, character arcs are the very bones of modern storytelling. The three-act play. That's Aeschylus whispering through time. The tragic hero undone by hubris, straight from Sophocles. Even the concept of a fourth wall, that invisible boundary between actor and audience, was something the Greeks played with centuries ago. The Romans, for all their love of spectacle, passed down a different inheritance: theatre as mass entertainment. Their open-air amphitheatres became the architectural model for everything from Shakespeare's Globe to modern sports arenas. And their comedies, full of farce, mistaken identities, and bawdy misunderstandings, laid the groundwork for Western sitcoms and slapstick. In the East, the impact of theatre is no less profound. Indian drama, with its focus on emotional resonance and the balance of aesthetic moods, rasa, influenced not just performance but classical dance, cinema, and poetry. The philosophical weight of the Natya Shastra continues to inform Indian storytelling today. Chinese opera, with its color-coded symbolism and stylized expression, inspired centuries of visual storytelling. Even martial arts cinema owes much to the rhythmic, choreographed combat of opera performers. Meanwhile, Japan's No and Bunraku remain living traditions, still performed, still revered, their minimalism influencing modern directors like Kurosawa and even Western experimental theatre. And the puppets, they've multiplied. From shadow plays in Southeast Asia to digital avatars on TikTok, the idea of animating the inanimate remains irresistible. Puppetry's ability to distill emotion into pure gesture has influenced everything from children's television to avant-garde performance art. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of ancient theatre is this: the human need to perform, to watch and be watched, to slip into another's skin and return changed. Every ritual, every meme, every monologue on a dim-lit stage is part of that same lineage. A search for meaning through motion, mask, and voice. So the next time you see a play, a film, or a TikTok skit, remember, you're witnessing not just entertainment, but a sacred echo. Theatre may have evolved, but it has never stopped being our oldest and most honest mirror. Serene was born into a world where bloodlines were everything, and hers was sharp as a sword. Her father was Philip II of Macedon, the man who turned a fractured kingdom into a military machine. Her mother was Audata, an Illyrian princess from a fierce warrior tribe to the west. Most Macedonian princesses were groomed for alliances and silk-draped diplomacy. But Serene? She was raised for war. From the moment she could walk, Serene lived under the weight of two powerful legacies: the tactical brilliance of her father and the unbreakable spirit of her Illyrian mother. While other royal girls were learning to weave, she was learning to wield a spear. Audata, unlike most Macedonian queens, didn't just tolerate this. She trained her daughter herself. In Illyrian culture, women could fight alongside men. Strength wasn't just admired, it was expected. Serene's early life was steeped in discipline. She rode horses across jagged terrain, practiced swordplay in the heat of the day, and studied the movements of armies instead of embroidery patterns. In the palace of Aegi, where her father plotted conquests, Serene absorbed everything. She listened at the edges of war councils, watched how generals deferred to Philip, and understood, far too early, that power wasn't given. It had to be taken. Being Philip's daughter came with advantages, but also danger. Her half-brother Alexander, born to Olympias, would become the center of Philip's world. The court buzzed with ambition, rivalry, and suspicion. Macedon wasn't a peaceful place, even at its peak. Murders, exiles, shifting alliances. This was her childhood. But Serene was no passive observer. Even as a girl, she cultivated presence. She trained harder, spoke more boldly, rode faster. She knew her name would never be Alexander, but she could still carve her own legacy in the cracks between empires. By her teenage years, she wasn't just admired, she was feared. Not only for her royal blood, but for her refusal to fit the mold of a royal woman. She wasn't a pawn, she was a blade. Serene was born in a palace, raised on horseback, and baptized in steel. She wasn't meant to survive in a man's world, she was meant to conquer it. To be born royal in Macedon was to be born into a game of strategy, but to be born the half-sister of Alexander the Great, that was a life spent balancing on a dagger's edge. Serene and Alexander shared the same father, Philip II, but different mothers. His mother, Olympias, was infamous for her ambition and ruthlessness. Hers, Ordata, was Illyrian royalty, tough as the mountain tribes she hailed from. From childhood, Serene knew she would never be the heir. That title had already been handed to Alexander, the golden boy with the lion's mane and the philosopher's tutor. The court adored him, the generals feared him, and the world one day would kneel before him. But Serene didn't kneel. As Alexander grew into the legend we now remember, Serene carved a quieter, sharper path. While he rode into Persia, she remained in Macedon, observing how empires functioned from within. She saw how alliances shifted like sand dunes, how one wrong word could end a dynasty. She learned the real battlefield wasn't always fought with swords. Sometimes it was fought in whispers. Still, she was no cloistered noblewoman. Serene's reputation as a warrior began to circulate. Rumors of her military prowess, her ability to ride, fight, and lead, echoed in the corridors of power. She may not have crossed deserts or stormed cities like Alexander, but she was no less dangerous. She had something he never did: silence. Serene didn't need the world to watch her. She needed them to underestimate her. But in a kingdom obsessed with lineage and legitimacy, blood was currency, and Serene had plenty of it. She was not only the daughter of Philip, but the sister of the king, and her Illyrian bloodline connected her to another branch of warriors. She could unite kingdoms, or break them. She didn't challenge Alexander, not directly. There was no battle between them. But she was a constant reminder that power didn't belong only to men. Her presence, her lineage, and her skill were threats. Quiet ones, but threats nonetheless. And when Alexander marched east to chase immortality, Serene stayed behind, watching the gears of empire turn. Waiting, studying. Because even the greatest shadow can't cover everything. Not forever. Serene wasn't content with being a figure of quiet potential. She made herself legend through action. While Alexander built his empire abroad, Serene found her own battlefield at home. And unlike many royal women of her time, she didn't just lead from behind a curtain. She rode in armor, led troops, and fought on horseback like a Macedonian general. Her most famous moment came when she led a military campaign into Illyria, the very land of her mother. It wasn't just a symbolic march. Serene actively commanded troops, organized strategy, and fought in combat. In a time when even noblemen often avoided the front lines, a royal woman charging into battle was both shocking and awe-inspiring. And it wasn't just for show. She emerged victorious. That campaign wasn't just a flex of military skill. It was a declaration. Serene was staking a claim. She wasn't merely a noblewoman with a sharp mind. She was a trained warrior who had proven herself on the field, bloodied and unbroken. Her Illyrian blood had not thinned in the halls of Macedonian diplomacy. It had sharpened. By winning that campaign, Serene did something extraordinary. She carved out a sphere of influence independent of her brother's colossal shadow. Alexander might have ruled eastward, but Serene was building something of her own in the west. Respect, loyalty, and a reputation not tied to anyone else's name. But power is never comfortable in the hands of a woman, especially a woman who doesn't ask permission. Back in Macedon, the court murmured. Alexander, too occupied with conquering Persia and Egypt, did not interfere. But his absence created a fragile vacuum, and Serene knew exactly how dangerous that space could become. She wasn't just a warrior for her own sake. She had a plan that reached beyond herself. She was a mother now, and she intended to pass on her power. So, while men wrote history in their own image, Serene prepared for the next move. She had tasted command, stained her armor in real combat, and won not by birthright but by merit. She was no mere royal. She was a commander, and she was just getting started. For all her victories and warrior spirit, Serene's most audacious move was not made with a sword, but with a daughter. Her child, Adea, was born of her marriage to Amyntas Forfa, a man who himself had royal blood but little political strength. Their union was strategic, a way for Serene to connect her bloodline deeper into the royal web. But Amyntas was soon dead, likely a victim of Philip II's relentless housecleaning. Serene, however, survived. More than that, she saw opportunity in the ashes. She began raising Adea not as a passive princess, but as a future queen. From the very beginning, Adea was trained with the same fire Serene had received as a girl. This wasn't a child being groomed for a decorative marriage. This was a young woman being sharpened like a blade. Serene personally oversaw her education, rhetoric, leadership, martial training, and most importantly, politics. It wasn't just about legacy. Serene had watched the world unravel in Alexander's absence. The court was divided, the generals restless, and succession uncertain. Alexander had no legitimate heir. His empire was vast but fragile. The question of who would rule once he died wasn't just theoretical. It was a ticking bomb. Serene had a plan. Her daughter would marry Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, who was considered next in line despite his intellectual disability. If Adea became his wife, and Serene her advisor, they would have real influence over the Macedonian throne. This was more than ambition. It was survival. The empire was splintering. Power was being hoarded by generals and regents. Serene saw that only through Adea could she continue to shape the future. She wasn't just trying to put her daughter on the throne. She was trying to protect Macedon from itself. But this was not a world kind to women who made moves like kings. Whispers turned to threats. The regents, particularly Perdiccas, one of Alexander's former generals, saw what was coming. A warrior mother raising a queen with a claim to the throne was too dangerous. Serene, ever bold, prepared to travel with Adea to ensure the marriage happened. She was ready for resistance, but not the betrayal that awaited her on the road. She had trained her daughter for the throne. Now, she would pay the price for it. Serene knew exactly what she was doing when she set out for Asia with her daughter. This was not a diplomatic visit. This was a political maneuver, the kind that could change the shape of an empire. Adea, young but regal, was to be married to King Aridaeus. That union would tie Serene's bloodline directly to the throne, and give her a front-row seat to the regency of Alexander's fractured empire. But the men in power saw it differently. To Perdiccas, the ambitious general serving as regent, Serene was not a royal matron. She was a threat, a woman with her own army, her own agenda, and worse still, public support. Soldiers admired her. Macedonians respected her. Her daughter had the blood of Philip, the charisma of a queen, and the backing of one of the last true heirs. Perdiccas couldn't risk it. As Serene and Adea crossed into Asia Minor, they were intercepted by forces under Alcetus, Perdiccas' own brother. The moment was tense, the outcome chillingly swift. Serene, unarmed but unshaken, stood her ground. Some sources say she demanded to see the king. Others suggest she attempted to rally the soldiers against the regents right there on the spot. But it was too late. The order had already been given. Serene was assassinated, likely by Alcetus himself, or under his command. On the road, far from court, far from justice. She died not in battle, but by betrayal. Stabbed not for her crimes, but for her ambition. What happened next shocked even hardened Macedonian veterans. The very soldiers who witnessed her murder reportedly rebelled. Serene, after all, was the daughter of Philip II, a war hero in her own right. Killing a woman of her stature wasn't just a crime, it was sacrilege. So intense was the backlash that Perdiccas was forced to backtrack. In a stunning reversal, he allowed Adea to marry Aridaeus after all. But the cost had been steep. Macedon had lost one of its most capable minds and most dangerous women, not to enemies, but to its own fears. Serene died with her armor off, but her strategy lived on. Her daughter was now queen. The next move was no longer hers, but it would still bear her name. Serene's death was supposed to end the threat, but instead it lit a fire. Her daughter, now married to King Aridaeus, entered the political arena with the fury of a legacy interrupted, and she did not remain a deer for long. In a powerful move, she changed her name to Eurydice, a name echoing queens of the Argead dynasty. It wasn't just a rebranding, it was a declaration of legitimacy. Queen Eurydice now stood beside the King of Macedon, not a puppet, not a consort, but a partner in rule. Though Aridaeus was mentally impaired and heavily controlled by regents like Perdiccas and later Antipater, Eurydice quickly became the active voice of the throne. She took an unprecedented step for a woman in Macedonian politics. She began addressing the army directly, wearing military attire and asserting her right to govern on behalf of her husband and herself. These weren't symbolic gestures. Eurydice stepped into the vacuum her mother left with military poise and political instinct. She held speeches in front of soldiers, grizzled veterans who had followed Alexander across the known world, and she won them over. She promised order, Macedonian strength, and a return to Argead leadership. Her mere presence reminded them of Serene, and the army listened. But her rise came at a dangerous moment. The wars of the Diadochi, the bloody civil wars between Alexander's former generals, were already underway. Macedon was fragmenting, alliances cracked, loyalties shifted like sand. Eurydice stood in the middle of it, a young queen with no army of her own, challenging men who commanded legions. Still, she played boldly. She stood up to Polyperchon, the newly appointed regent, and tried to maintain control of the capital. She refused to back down, writing letters, issuing orders, rallying troops. For a time she seemed unstoppable. But like her mother, Eurydice's power came not just from her bloodline, but from the threat she posed to men in power. She was Serene's daughter through and through, armored in pride, fluent in strategy, and unafraid to confront the ruling elite. Her story, like her mother's, would be defined not by submission, but by defiance. And though she now wore the crown her mother had fought for, the enemies gathering around her would not tolerate a queen who ruled like a king. Eurydice's rise to power was swift, but so was the storm that followed. The Macedonian Empire, already fracturing under the weight of Alexander's absence, had become a battlefield of old generals all clawing for control. At the heart of this chaos was Polyperchon, the aging general newly appointed as regent. To him, Eurydice was an anomaly, young, ambitious, and worst of all, politically effective. She had the troops, she had the bloodline, and she had the fire of Serene running in her veins. At first, Eurydice tried diplomacy. She challenged Polyperchon in writing, issuing royal decrees in her own name. She appeared in military dress before the army, calling out his authority. These were not empty gestures. For a moment, the balance of power seemed to teeter in her favor. Many in the army remembered her mother, and some were willing to follow her. But Polyperchon wasn't alone. He had a powerful ally, Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. After years in exile, Olympias returned to Macedon with vengeance in her heart and murder in her strategy. The rivalry between the two women, Eurydice and Olympias, was more than personal. It was the final, brutal clash of two dynastic visions. Eurydice stood for a new order, young, militaristic, and independent. Olympias represented the old Argead fire, the bloodline that had once ruled unchallenged. Eurydice marched to confront her enemies but was betrayed. Her troops, faced with the revered Olympias and her more experienced forces, abandoned her. She and King Aridaeus were captured. The crown, once so close, was ripped from her head. What came next was not politics, it was revenge. Olympias had Eurydice imprisoned and forced her to commit suicide. The daughter of Serene, like her mother, died not in battle, but because she dared to claim power in a man's world. Her husband was murdered soon after. Their deaths weren't just executions. They were warnings, etched in blood, sent to every woman who might think of leading armies or wearing crowns. But even in death, Eurydice left a mark. Her story became legend, whispered among soldiers, and remembered by historians as a flash of defiance in a darkening world. She had inherited her mother's soul and shared her fate. Cynaine and Eurydice are rarely mentioned in the same breath as Alexander, Philip, or Olympias. Their names linger on the margins of history, footnotes in an empire obsessed with male conquest. Yet their lives, full of courage, strategy, and resistance, carved a path through the brutal politics of their time. They were more than noble women. They were a dynasty of defiance. Cynaine had been a daughter of Philip, trained not to marry well, but to fight well. She had stepped onto a battlefield when most royal women were stepping into marriage contracts. She had outlived her husband, outmaneuvered her enemies, and trained her daughter for power in a world that had no room for powerful women. In an age where even queens had little agency, Cynaine led troops into combat, and not for ceremonial show. She fought to win. Her daughter inherited that fire, and when Cynaine died by assassination, Eurydice took the torch and carried it to the throne. She may have ruled briefly, but her impact was unforgettable. In front of assembled soldiers, Eurydice stood in full military dress and addressed them as commander. She wasn't a pawn. She wasn't waiting to be chosen. She chose herself, and that's what made them dangerous. The men who killed them weren't only defending political control. They were defending a system, a world where women could inspire loyalty, but not lead armies, could bear heirs, but not rule empires. Cynaine and Eurydice proved that women didn't need permission to claim power. They only needed opportunity. What's extraordinary is how close they came to succeeding. In another timeline, one less afraid of their strength, Cynaine might have led campaigns alongside Alexander. Eurydice might have stabilized the throne, restoring Macedonian pride after Alexander's empire collapsed. Instead, both were killed not for failure, but for being too effective. Their legacies survive in fragments. Roman historians mention them in passing. A few ancient coins hint at Eurydice's brief reign. But the full weight of their stories has been buried under centuries of male-focused glory. Still, the outline remains. A mother who trained like a soldier, and a daughter who ruled like a king. They were born into conquest, and in their own fierce, tragic way, they left a conquest of their own. Cynaine and Eurydice were silenced, but their stories never truly vanished. They linger, like distant thunder in the chronicles of empire, like blood on a blade that history tried to polish clean. For centuries, they were overshadowed by their male relatives, by Alexander's brilliant campaigns, by Philip's reforms, by Olympia's deadly cunning. But if you look closely, you can trace their presence like footprints through wet earth. Cynaine, who led soldiers into Illyria and returned victorious. Eurydice, who donned armor and defied generals face to face. Neither ruled long, neither died peacefully. But their courage left a blueprint for resistance, for female power, for what a woman could be in an empire designed to crush her. Their erasure is part of a pattern. Ancient historians, mostly men, recorded events through the lens of power and prestige. Women like Cynaine weren't celebrated. They were feared, minimized, or written off as ambitious beyond their station. But the fragments survive, in brief lines, in bitter deaths, in the outrage of armies who witnessed their assassinations and recoiled at the injustice. And in those fragments, something remarkable remains. Willpower. Neither woman needed a crown to claim authority. They embodied it, through action, leadership, and sheer presence. Their power wasn't inherited, but forged from training fields, battle scars, and public defiance. Cynaine's very existence challenged the idea that only men could shape the world. Eurydice proved a woman could wear royal regalia and speak to warriors without trembling. Even today, their names raise questions. What might have changed had they lived longer? Could Macedon have held together under Eurydice's rule? Could Serene have been the war leader Macedon needed after Alexander's death? We'll never know. But the possibility itself is a legacy. Modern scholars are beginning to rediscover them, pulling their stories from the dust of forgotten scrolls. Not as side characters, but as protagonists of their own brutal, brilliant narratives. Cynae and Eurydice didn't survive their world, but they disrupted it. And for that, they echo, not as ghosts of empire, but as reminders of what power looks like when it refuses to beg for permission. Their crowns were stolen, their stories almost erased, but their fire still burns, even if history tried to bury the ashes. Before there were belts, masters, or cinematic legends, martial arts began in the silence between survival and the sacred. Across early civilizations, the act of fighting wasn't just practical, it was ritualistic. It was how communities trained their bodies, protected their borders, and shaped their spirits. The earliest martial arts didn't emerge from sport, they grew out of necessity. Long before writing, people were already grappling, striking, and weapon training. But over time, simple survival turned into something deeper. Combat became a discipline, a code, a path toward mastery, not just of the body, but of the self. Take ancient hunters, for example. Their movements, lunges, thrusts, evasions, became the foundation of martial patterns. Each hunt was a rehearsal for war, and every war demanded a stronger, smarter, more synchronized warrior. But when weapons were laid down, the movements remained. They were practiced again and again, until they became ritual, a kind of physical language that could be passed down across generations. Across the world, this pattern repeated. In the Indus Valley, carved seals from over 4,000 years ago show figures in stances eerily similar to those in modern martial arts. In Africa, tribal wrestling formed the basis of coming-of-age ceremonies. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, soldiers trained in organized formations, but also honed personal combat styles, ones involving hand-to-hand strikes and grappling holds. Their physicality was a kind of literacy. To fight was to speak the language of kings. And always, combat was paired with symbolism. Movements mimicked animals, spirits, or cosmic forces. A strike wasn't just a blow, it was the embodiment of a myth. A sequence of motions could mirror a battle between gods, or serve as a prayer for protection. Martial practice became ceremonial, integrated into festivals, funerals, and religious rites. Even in death, warriors were honored for their form. Ancient tombs contain weapons carefully placed beside skeletons, not as tools, but as symbols of identity. The sword wasn't just something you carried, it was who you were. So in these ancient worlds, martial arts weren't side activities, they were essential rites, a merging of the physical, the mental, and the divine. It wasn't about fighting, it was about becoming. In the misty palm-covered hills of southern India lies the ancient birthplace of what many believe to be the world's oldest martial art. Kalaripayattu. Born in the region of Kerala, this system dates back over 3,000 years, and possibly more, emerging from a civilization where combat, medicine, and spiritual practice were deeply intertwined. The word Kalari refers to a training ground, and Payattu means to fight or practice. But Kalaripayattu was never just about fighting. It was a discipline of transformation, a system where warriors trained not only to defeat enemies, but to master themselves. It combined strikes, grapples, and weapon techniques with deep breath control, meditation, and stretches that predate modern yoga. According to tradition, the art was shaped by the sage Parashurama, a divine warrior believed to have reclaimed the land of Kerala from the sea. He created Kalaripayattu not merely as a combat system, but as a sacred path to balance power with wisdom. Students began training at a young age, learning body control, flexibility, and agility before ever touching a weapon. The training grounds, or Kalaris, were considered sacred spaces. Entering the Kalari was a ritual. Students bowed to the earth, the gods, and their master. Lessons began with Mepayatu, the body conditioning sequences. These were fluid, almost dance-like routines meant to awaken every muscle, tendon, and joint. The movements drew from nature, the strikes of the snake, the grace of the peacock, the ferocity of the lion. Weapons came later: wooden sticks, curved swords, daggers, spears, and the legendary urumi, a flexible, whip-like blade so dangerous it required total body mastery to wield safely. But alongside combat, students also learned Ayurvedic medicine, how to heal what they had the power to hurt. And there was always philosophy. Kalaripayattu taught humility, patience, and respect for life. Victory without control was failure. Power without compassion was chaos. When foreign invaders arrived, first the Portuguese, later the British, Kalaripayattu was suppressed. But it never died. It went underground, passed on in whispers and footwork, hidden in dance and disguised as healing. Today, it still survives, not just as a martial art, but as a living link to one of humanity's earliest visions of what it means to be both a warrior and a sage. To most of the world, the phrase martial arts brings to mind one word: kung fu. But in China, kung fu, gong fu, doesn't just mean fighting. It means mastery earned through effort, whether in calligraphy, cooking, or combat. And nowhere is that spirit more fully embodied than in the ancient martial traditions rooted in the temples, mountains, and battlefields of early China. The origins of Chinese martial arts stretch back over 4,000 years. Ancient military texts from the Zhou dynasty describe hand-to-hand combat drills, weapon techniques, and battlefield formations. But the true heart of Kung Fu emerged where philosophy met motion, in the silence of the monasteries. The most famous origin story begins in the Shaolin Temple, a Buddhist sanctuary nestled in the Song Mountains. Legend says that in the 5th century CE, a monk named Bodhidharma, who travelled from India, introduced meditative practices that would evolve into Shaolin Kung Fu. He noticed that the monks, weakened from long hours of seated meditation, needed physical conditioning to balance the spirit. So he taught them forms, fluid movements that mimicked animals, synchronized breath, and sharpened awareness. Over centuries, these forms became complex martial systems, each with its own rhythm, philosophy, and purpose. Tiger style for strength, crane for grace, snake for fluidity. Every motion was a metaphor for a principle: attack with speed, defend with emptiness, strike with inner stillness. Shaolin monks weren't just fighters, they were spiritual athletes. They believed that to master combat, you must first conquer the self. This wasn't about brute strength, it was about internal power. The idea of qi, life energy, was central. Movements weren't random. They were vessels for circulating qi, balancing yin and yang, aligning body with cosmos. Kung Fu also branched beyond Shaolin. Taoist monks in the Wudang Mountains developed their own soft-flowing styles, like Tai Chi, which emphasized harmony, breath, and the redirection of force. These styles prioritized energy control over impact, showing that martial power could come from yielding, not clashing. Throughout dynastic wars, cultural revolutions, and modernization, Kung Fu endured, not just as combat training, but as a living philosophy. It taught ethics, restraint, and discipline, to fight without anger, to win without arrogance. Because in China, the true enemy was never just an opponent. It was imbalance within. In the dust of ancient Greek arenas, under the blazing sun of Olympia, there was a martial art so raw and so complete, it made even seasoned hoplites flinch. It was called pancration, a word that means all powers, or total strength. And it wasn't just a sport. It was warfare, stripped of weapons and placed at the feet of the gods. Pancration first entered the Olympic Games in 648 BCE, and almost immediately it became legendary. A blend of wrestling and striking, this was full contact combat at its most primal. Competitors punched, kicked, grappled, choked, and broke bones. The only two rules: no biting, no eye gouging, everything else was fair game. But pancration wasn't chaos, it was discipline. Fighters trained in strategy and control, not wild brutality. They studied the mechanics of the human body, where to strike, how to pivot, when to lock a joint or crush the windpipe. They trained relentlessly in the palestra, where gymnastic conditioning met hand-to-hand tactics. Pancratiasts were admired not just for strength, but for technique and mental toughness. And the art wasn't confined to the games. Greek soldiers practiced pancration for the battlefield. It was part of the warrior's toolkit. If your spear broke, your shield splintered, and your sword fell, you fought with pancration. Close quarters, bare-handed, and unforgiving. Legendary tales grew around its champions. One speaks of Aristion of Phigalia, who died during a match after locking his opponent in a final submission hold. Though lifeless, his opponent conceded defeat, and Aristion was crowned victor posthumously. He became the embodiment of what pancration represented: absolute commitment, even unto death. Yet, like many ancient martial systems, pancration faded with time. When Rome absorbed Greece, gladiatorial spectacle overtook it. Later, with the fall of the pagan world and the rise of new cultural orders, its practice all but vanished. But its legacy lived on, in the philosophy of using the whole body as a weapon, in the balance of aggression and control, and in the roots it planted in modern combat sports like MMA. Today, historians and martial artists alike view pancration as one of the most complete fighting systems of the ancient world. Because to the Greeks, true strength wasn't just about violence. It was about mastering every part of yourself in the moment when everything else was lost. When we think of ancient Egypt, we think of pyramids, pharaohs, and gods with animal heads. But beneath the golden mask of Tutankhamun and the shadow of the Sphinx was a militarized civilization where martial skill wasn't just a soldier's tool, it was a path to honor and status. Egypt's earliest records of martial arts appear not in text, but in art. On the walls of tombs in Beni Hassan, dating back to around 2000 BCE, there are over 400 depictions of grappling techniques, throws, locks, and stances. These images, striking in detail, show that Egyptian warriors trained in unarmed combat with surprising sophistication. Wrestling was not a pastime, it was a national passion. Young nobles trained in martial disciplines from an early age. Combat was seen as both physical excellence and spiritual preparation. The soldier wasn't just a fighter, he was a protector of Mayat, the divine balance of the world. To train the body was to prepare to defend that cosmic order. But Egypt's martial tradition extended far beyond wrestling. Warriors were schooled in stick fighting, known today in its modern descendant as tatib. This elegant yet fierce art involved rhythmic movements with a long staff, often performed to drums. Though it evolved into a ceremonial dance over the centuries, its roots were deeply martial, used by guards, soldiers, and royal bodyguards. Weapons training included archery, spears, daggers, and battle axes, but close-quarters combat was no less important. Egyptian warriors had to be versatile. In chariot warfare, for instance, soldiers were trained to shoot with deadly precision while racing at full speed. An ancient form of mobile martial art that demanded nerves of steel and unbreakable focus. Even in myth, martial prowess mattered. Gods like Horus, the falcon-headed protector, were warriors first, locked in eternal combat with chaos. Pharaohs modelled themselves on these divine fighters, presenting their victories as reflections of divine will. War was sacred, and those who fought it were not just men. They were instruments of order. Though Egypt's martial systems never survived in a formal lineage like Shaolin Kung Fu or Kalaripayattu, their spirit remains, etched in stone, in rhythm, and in ritual. Because along the Nile, to fight was not just to conquer. It was to preserve the universe itself. Long before the word samurai echoed through scrolls and songs, Japan's martial identity was already forming in the misty valleys and storm-swept shores of its islands. The origins of Japanese martial arts lie not in modern karate dojos or sword-fighting duels, but in ancient ritual, clan warfare, and spiritual discipline. In the earliest centuries, during the Yayoi and Kofun periods, warriors fought with bronze weapons, stone-tipped arrows, and raw, practical techniques designed for survival. These early forms lacked structure, but emphasized efficiency, group cohesion, and instinctual movement. Fighting wasn't just physical, it was deeply tribal. Loyalty to clan and family was everything. To fight well was to protect your bloodline. But as Japan entered the Heian period, 794–1185 CE, martial culture began to crystallize. Mounted archery became central. The ideal warrior wasn't just a brute with a sword, he was a horseman, archer, and scholar. This period gave rise to the bushi, the early prototype of the samurai, whose code blended battlefield skill with personal honor. The foundation of many Japanese martial arts developed from this evolving warrior class. One of the earliest systems was kyujutsu, the art of the bow. Archers trained to shoot from horseback using the yumi, a tall, asymmetrical bow, requiring extraordinary strength and control. Over time, this evolved into kyudo, the way of the bow, which emphasized not just aim, but spiritual focus, breath, and mindfulness. Kenjutsu, or sword technique, also began to emerge, though swords were not yet the dominant weapon. Techniques were battlefield-tested, direct, and often brutal, far from the polished forms we associate with modern katana duels. Swords were tools, not symbols. Yet within the folds of these techniques, a code of conduct was growing. By the time of the Kamakura period, this code evolved into what we now know as Bushido, the way of the warrior. Honor, loyalty, self-discipline, and inner peace became as vital as victory. Martial training became not just preparation for war, but a moral path. Swordsmanship, archery, and later hand-to-hand combat systems like jujutsu were practiced as both physical arts and spiritual exercises. In early Japan, to fight was to follow a path of balance between life and death, technique and heart, body and soul. And the warrior wasn't just expected to win, he was expected to die well. When we talk about the origins of martial arts, Africa is too often left out of the conversation. But across this vast and diverse continent, ancient cultures developed powerful, sophisticated, and deeply rooted martial traditions. Systems shaped by survival, spirituality, and ceremony. These weren't just methods of combat. They were expressions of identity, heritage, and sacred duty. One of the most enduring African martial practices is dambe, the ancient combat sport of the Hausa people in West Africa. Traditionally performed by butchers and members of warrior guilds, dambe combines bare-knuckle boxing with powerful low kicks. Fighters wrap one hand, called the spear, in cloth or hardened rope, while the other remains open for defense. Matches often take place during harvest festivals and public gatherings, turning combat into celebration. But make no mistake, this is warrior training, preserved through ritual. In Senegal, another ancient tradition thrives, Liam, or Senegalese wrestling. More than a sport, Liam is a national art form, its roots reaching back to pre-Islamic times when it served as a rite of passage for young men. Wrestlers engage in powerful grappling, accompanied by drums, dance, and spiritual chants. Before combat, fighters often consult marabouts, spiritual leaders, who offer charms and blessings. Strength alone won't guarantee victory. One must also have spiritual favor. Farther south in Zulu culture, the martial legacy of Nguni stick fighting tells a different story. Practiced by young Zulu boys as part of initiation and military training, this art involves a striking stick and a blocking stick, used in lightning-fast exchanges. Beyond preparing boys for future combat, Stick fighting also built courage, reflexes, and a warrior's mindset. Even the legendary Shaka Zulu was said to have refined battle techniques by observing and modifying traditional stick fighting strategies into formations that reshaped southern African warfare. In Ethiopia, historical paintings and manuscripts depict soldiers using spears, shields, and short swords in tightly organized formations, sometimes accompanied by wrestling traditions that emphasized throws and body control, skills necessary in both battle and ritual. In African martial arts, the line between fight and festival, battle and belief, was always thin. Movement was meaning, combat was culture. And across the continent, the warrior was more than a fighter. He was a protector, a performer, and a living vessel of his people's spirit. Long before European ships touched the shores of the Americas, the indigenous peoples of the continents had already developed rich and complex martial traditions. These systems weren't organized into schools or written down in manuals, but they were real, practiced, and deeply embedded in culture, ceremony, and survival. Among the Aztecs, martial culture was central to civilization. From an early age, boys were sent to Telpochcali, or youth training houses, where they learned warfare, discipline, and weapons handling. The macuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with obsidian blades, was a symbol of elite warriors. It could slice through flesh with terrifying ease. But Aztec martial arts were more than technique. They were tied to religion. Warfare was a sacred duty, a way to capture prisoners for ritual sacrifice, and a path to honor in the afterlife. Aztec warriors were organized into elite orders, such as the Eagle and Jaguar warriors, whose names weren't just titles, they were spiritual identities. Combat was a way to embody the spirit of the animal, to transform oneself into a living weapon, guided by divine purpose. Farther south, the Inca Empire had its own formidable martial culture. While the Inca are better known for engineering and empire building, they trained soldiers extensively. Their warriors used slings, spears, bolas, and clubs with strategic precision, and trained in formations suited to mountain warfare. Young warriors were taught strength, endurance, and loyalty to the state. Warfare was not just political, it was ritualized, a test of cosmic balance. In the North American regions, many indigenous tribes practiced warrior rites tied closely to spiritual life. The Lakota, Apache, and Comanche, for example, had deep warrior traditions involving stealth, ambush tactics, horsemanship, and close-quarters combat. Skills were honed through hunting, scouting, and intertribal conflict. But what mattered as much as bravery was humility. The ideal warrior was disciplined, honorable, and bound to the welfare of the tribe. Combat training was often expressed through games and dances, ritualized forms of preparation that built strength, reflexes, and unity. The war dance wasn't just theater, it was a moving invocation, blending spirit with strike, rhythm with readiness. Across the Americas, martial arts weren't isolated techniques, they were extensions of worldviews. To fight was to serve, not just the tribe, but the land, the ancestors, and the balance of all things. What began as survival, how to hunt, how to defend, how to kill, became something far deeper. Across the ancient world, martial arts evolved into spiritual disciplines, tools for shaping not just warriors, but entire cultures. From India to China, from Africa to the Americas, every civilization developed its own system of combat. But what unites them isn't just the strikes, holds, or weapons. It's how those movements became ritual. Training grounds turned into sacred spaces. Warriors became symbols of cosmic order. Combat itself became a path, not to destruction, but to self-mastery. These early martial arts didn't teach violence for its own sake. They taught control, humility, and balance. In Kalarippayattu, the fighter is also a healer. In Kung Fu, the battle is internal as much as external. In Pancration, the test is mental endurance as much as physical skill. Even in the tribal dances of Africa and the war games of the Americas, the lesson is the same. True strength lies not in dominance, but in discipline. Over time, Many of these traditions were suppressed, scattered, or transformed by conquest, colonization, and modernization. The British banned Kalarippayattu. Chinese martial arts were driven underground during political upheavals. African systems were masked in ritual to survive. Native American combat knowledge was pushed aside by force, and yet, none of it truly disappeared. Fragments survived in folk dance, oral storytelling, community rituals. Others resurfaced in modern martial arts, reborn in karate, judo, capoeira, MMA, and more. The roots are ancient, even if the forms are new. Today, when someone steps onto a mat, bows before a teacher, or learns a new technique, they're not just learning how to fight. They're participating in a lineage that stretches back thousands of years, where motion is memory and every movement is a whisper from the past. The ancient masters may be gone, their battles long finished, but their philosophies endure. They taught that martial arts are not about defeating others. They're about defeating yourself, again and again, until ego, fear, and rage fall away. What remains is stillness, precision, purpose. Because in the end, every martial art, no matter its origin, tells the same story. The journey of a human being learning how to be strong, not just with the fist, but with the spirit.